Hey everybody, Anthony here from Crazy Tech Lab, and today I've got a great video for you, especially for all you small form factor fans, because we are checking out my current favorite slim 120mm fan. And this is it here. It is the SilverStone Air Slimmer 120 RGB. We've actually already included this fan in my recent group test of slim fans, which you can see the banner up above or in the link to it in the description below, as well as buy links where you can pick this thing up right now and in the description below. And this thing absolutely knocked it out the park when it came to performance. But what we didn't do last time is just did an unboxing to see what you get in the box and actually have a look at its RGB lighting, because obviously if you want to go for a fan with RGB lighting, you kind of want to know what it looks like. So that's what we're focusing on today. We will be going through the performance numbers because I know that not all of you out there will want to go through my slim 120mm fan group test, although I do highly recommend that you do, because it's got lots of great fans in there, links to where you can buy them all, and some of them might appeal to you more than this fan does. For example, you might not want RGB lighting. There are other fans in that group test that perform really, really well and can potentially save you some money as well, because this fan is reasonably expensive. It's around $20 to $30. About the same in pounds here in the UK, so it's not cheap, but it does offer absolutely spectacular performance. So today we'll be taking a quick look at those performance numbers. As I said, we have already done that in the previous group test, but we will be going over them again today in a slightly short form. But we will be focusing on its RGB performance. Thanks to Silverstone for sending this fan over, and also thanks to today's sponsor with a message now for you. Our sponsor today is scdkey.com, where right now you can get great deals on software such as Windows 10, Windows 11 and Microsoft Office. And even better is I've got a 25% discount code to share with you guys. Windows 10 Professional, for example, which is fully upgradable for free to Windows 11. All you have to do is click Buy Now, enter the code CRT25 into the promotion code box, click Apply, and the US price will drop from $22.09 down to just $16.57, and in the UK, you'll see the price fall to just £12.79. Once you've paid, head over to your order page, click the Get Key button, and copy your Windows key code. When you're in Windows, you want to move your mouse over to the Start button, right-click, go to Settings, then Update and Security, and then move up to Activation, and finally click on Change Your Product Key, copy and paste your brand new product key into the box, click Next, then click Activate, and your Windows 10 installation is now activated. You can do the exact same thing with Office 2021 Professional, CRT 25, click Apply, and you will see a hefty discount. Thanks again to SCD Key for sponsoring today's video. So thanks to SCD Keys for sponsoring today's video, and let's crack on with the review. So here we are with the Air Slimmer 120 RGB then, and not really that much to talk about because we don't have any radiator screws like we did with the Corsair fan, which also had an RGB controller. It's just the fan, your typical fan screws, which I won't waste your time showing you here because they're just fan screws. But something you should be aware of is the proprietary connectors that this fan uses. So not sure why Silverstone has done this. Maybe it's cheaper, or it has plans to include this with some of its radiators or something, but essentially they're sort of miniaturized versions of the cables. So the one on the right here is like a miniature or micro PWM connector, but the other end of it is just a standard PWM connector. And it's the same with the RGB cable as well, which can also be daisy chained to other fans and that kind of thing to save on cable clutter. And interestingly, the PWM connector here, the male one that goes into the fan connector, is the same that Gigabyte uses on its Mini ITX motherboards. You might have noticed that it has adapters to convert that to a standard 4-pin connector. It's actually the same connector. So don't know whether it's a bit of future looking there. Maybe we'll see those connectors on a lot of Mini ITX and small form factor focused hardware in future, just because they save space. They might even be cheaper as well, who knows. But something else I wanted to show you is the similarity between this fan and the Corsair. So this is the Air Slimmer 120 RGB versus the Corsair AF 120 Slim, and the fans are pretty similar. There are more fan blades on the Corsair, but the fan blades are slightly different too. So first glance I thought, oh, they look really, really similar, but the blades on the Air Slimmer are actually kind of quite sharp. If you look at the corners down there, they are quite sharp down on that corner down there, whereas on the Corsair they're much more rounded. So I think you can see that there's no kind of sharp angle down at the corner there. So kind of interesting. The blades on the Corsair also seem to be quite flat, whereas the ones on the Silverstone really dig into the air. So just kind of interesting, the different ways that these fans manufacture, just slightly different fan blade design, and otherwise very, very similar. But obviously the Silverstone having much, much better airflow, which we'll get to in a minute. My test system uses a Core i5 11600K, which is water-cooled, and in that loop are radiators, so we can strap fans to those radiators to get real-world CPU temperature results between each fan. The anemometer, which measures airflow in meters per second, is placed behind the radiator, so measuring airflow coming through the radiator, which is a great way to assess static pressure and general performance of fans when you attach them to radiators, and the decibel meter is placed nearby to take sound readings. First up, we have the overall score. Now, this one I've brought to the front of all the data analysis because I know that there are probably a few of you out there that don't want to have to trawl through dozens and dozens of graphs and all the data that I've spent my time doing, so I've got no problem with you doing that at all. So what we've got here basically is something rather clunky. It's literally just me giving each fan a score depending on where it sits in the rest of the graphs. So obviously, the more points a fan has here, the higher it sits in the majority of the graphs overall. So, for example, we do have an absolutely stunning result for the Silverstone Air Slimmer here, 175 points, which means that it sits at the top or near the top in pretty much every single graph. Now, there are some other results here that we should mention. So the Alpha Cool, Rosewell, and the Corsair fans also score pretty well. And that just means that they either score very, very highly in a few tests, or they score reasonably well in a lot of tests. So that's where I suggest, if you think, right, well, I've heard good things about the Corsair or the Arctic, for example, I want to go through and check out the how it actually scores in the rest of the graphs. That's a great idea, because this isn't an at-a-glance, unequivocal recommendation, other than the Silverstone fan, of course. Most of the other fans have shortcomings in one or two particular areas, and the further down the graph you go, the more shortcomings those fans have. So that's why this graph should be taken with a pinch of salt to some extent, but as you near the top of the graph, you know that those fans are performing really, really well in more and more tests. Overall here, though, it's an absolute whitewash for the Silverstone Air Slimmer. It's an absolutely stunning fan, and as you can see, it's scoring really, really highly in most of the tests here today. Now, this next graph is equally interesting and fairly easy to get your head around. It's literally just the overall score, but we have the pricing overlaid here. So this is in dollars. Obviously, I can't cover every single currency out there. I'm sorry, I just can't do that. I know that there were a few of you that were complaining that I'd recommend fans that were really expensive in your area. Well, I can't cover every single currency, obviously, because doing so would just take up way too much time. So we're doing dollars, which is basically the currency of the vast majority of my readers. So you'll have to use your own brain cells if one particular fan is a lot more expensive in your area and another one is cheaper, you'll just have to make your own judgment call on that. So here, though, we can see that the Silverstone Air Slimmer sits at the top of the graph, and it actually cost only $17 when I looked for it recently, and that's a lot cheaper than quite a few of the other top performing fans out there. So the Corsair AF 120 Slim, for example, that's $27, about the same for the RGB version as well. The Alpha Cool SL15 PWM is $25, a really good performing fan, but it does cost more than the Silverstone. So the Silverstone fan doing pretty well in terms of value and definitely in terms of performance as well. So getting into some real data now then, and using my anemometer to measure the airflow in meters per second, we have basically a wall-to-wall win for the Silverstone Air Slimmer. This thing is absolutely stunning here. So full speed airflow, it won, and it beat the Corsair AF 120 Slim, despite that fan offering stunning airflow at full speed. At 1500 RPM, so dropping down, and we have the Silverstone right up there at the top as well. And as you can see, the graph changes quite a bit at this one, because this is basically all the fans limited to the same RPM. So full speed, obviously they all have different RPMs. 1500, they're all sitting there at the same speed. So this is a really good, that graph, the 1500 RPM graph, is a really good test of just how efficient the fans are in terms of spinning versus airflow. So the Silverstone is staying at the top, and other fans like the Corsair really drop away here if they if you actually have like an airflow or RPM normalized setting. So the Corsair dropping way down the graph, and it does so again at 1000 RPM, and again at 1000 RPM the Silverstone is top. So the fact that it gets the best result at full speed, 1500 RPM and 1000 RPM, is really quite remarkable. You know, you don't really see that from many other fans. The Alpha Cool, again, this is where we're seeing that it doesn't top the graph all the time, but it scores consistently highly. So here it does pretty well, stays near the top in every single test. So it's just one area that the Silverstone S Slimmer is very, very dominant. Now, in these graphs, what we've got is different RPMs at 1000 RPM, 1500 RPM, and full speed for each fan, and the noise level associated with that. Now, obviously, RPM is kind of, I wouldn't say it's an arbitrary reading, but it's just, all it is how fast the fan blades are moving. So it doesn't really automatically equate to performance. You might have one fan that's really, really efficient and can generate incredible airflow at just 1000 RPM. You might get another fan that can spin at 2000 RPM and it's incredibly noisy and doesn't really perform very well. So more RPM doesn't always mean more performance, at least when you're comparing one fan to another. That's why you shouldn't read too much into this graph other than seeing which fans were the quietest at certain speeds. What's more interesting will be the next graph, because that's the airflow based on noise normalized testing. So we will move on to that in just a second, not before saying that the Silverstone is a reasonably loud fan in most tests, but that's because it's generating a heck of a lot more airflow as well, and it doesn't really generate that much more noise. In fact, at full speed, there were situations where it was actually slightly quieter than a lot of other highly performing fans out there. Now we have the noise normalized testing. So with this test, I set each fan to a specific noise level, and we've got two noise levels here because that's what most of the fans were able to do at the high end and the low end in terms of noise levels. So 50 dBA is kind of what most of the fans would be hitting at around 70 to 90% of their speed rating. So you're probably looking at around 1500 to 2000 RPM. So if you're playing a game or doing something fairly heavy on the CPU and there's a lot of heat being generated, this is generally where your fans will be performing. Whereas 44 dBA is kind of to the lower end, so it's idle up to medium loads, and probably more towards the medium loads there. So what we've got is the Silverstone Air Slimmer massively outperforming every single other fan here. So if you set each fan to the same noise level, the Silverstone Air Slimmer is generating much more airflow out the back of a radiator, and as that's out the back of a radiator, you can basically assume that it's generating really great static pressure there as well, because if there was not great static pressure being produced, there wouldn't be a lot of airflow getting through that radiator. And again here we've got the Alpha Cool SL15 sitting fairly high up the graph. Now what's very telling here are fans such as the Corsair AF120 Slim, which doesn't really perform that well at the same noise levels. So it might perform great in terms of airflow, but in terms of airflow versus noise, it's not really doing great. And the amazing thing here is that the Silverstone seems to do really well right up and down the graph, or up and down the noise spectrum. So even at 44 dBA, where the RPMs are really backed off, you're still getting great airflow. But we kind of already saw that in the airflow graphs, didn't we? So again, a great result here for Silverstone. Now, these graphs are where things get pretty interesting, because what we're looking at here is essentially the efficiency of each fan. It's the ability to generate airflow and static pressure for as little noise as possible, and that is more true the further you actually go up the graph. So surprise, surprise, we have the Silverstone Air Slimmer sitting at the top of every RPM here. We've got 1000 RPM, we've got 1500 RPM, and full speed, which I think is around 1800 to 2000 RPM for most of the fans in the graph. So super impressive from Silverstone here, the fact that it manages the best efficiency at every single RPM. So it's not often that you see a fan basically performing well at various different speed ranges. So Very, very impressive here from Silverstone, and nearly as impressive is the Alpha Cool, because that also did really, really well at all the speed ranges. But some fans don't do that well. For example, the Corsair AF120 Slim, very good efficiency at full speed. It was pretty loud, but it had mega airflow as a kind of counteract that. But if you move on to the 1500 and 1000 RPM, it becomes far less efficient at generating airflow for lower noise, so slips well down the graph in those situations. And weirdly, the ProLimitech Ultra Sleek Vortex 12 suddenly leapt up at 1000 RPM and actually generated reasonable airflow for the noise that it produces, but it's terrible at higher speeds. So just goes to show how much fan design can actually impact the efficiency at specific speed ranges. And fans to avoid here really are the older Silverstone FM124, bottom in every single test, so you definitely don't want to get that one mixed up with the Air Slimmer that we're looking at today. And also the ID Cooling 12015 XT, just not great efficiency at any speed. The next graph we have is subjective sound quality. So this is essentially how pleasant each fan is to sit next to, in my opinion. So obviously your opinion may differ when it comes to owning these fans, but obviously this is my opinion given that I've sat next to every single fan here, whereas I'm not expecting most people out there to have sat next to a dozen slim fans. So this is, I don't want anybody saying, oh, you know, I disagree with you on this because I've got this fan and it sounds great. Well, I've sat next to all of them, and this is basically my opinion of what each fan sounds like compared to the other ones. So for example, if you've got the Scythe Kaze Flex and you think it's a great fan, it sounds fantastic. Well, in my opinion, the Arctic P12 Slim or the Silverstone Air Slimmer sound better. They are more pleasant to sit next to. And what we've got here is essentially tones coming from the fan. You don't want that. You don't want it to whine. You don't want it to click or any kind of weird sounds coming from the bearing. You just want the fan to just exhibit a gentle airflow noise, that kind of thing. So the further the fans are up the graph, the better the sound quality. Obviously we have different speeds and airflows involved here as well, but this is just kind of fixed at 50 dBA and at full speed. So where the sound meter is saying they're reading 50 dBA, this is basically how pleasant the fans are. So if you kind of ramp them all up to a similar noise level, what does that noise actually sound like? Is it pleasant to sit next to, or is it quite unpleasant? So that's what these scores are, and the Silverstone scoring very highly in both these tests, with the Alpha Cool scoring better at full speed. Arctic is also worth a mention here, and also is thermal right too. Now, we've had airflow to noise level in the past. That was a pretty interesting graph because that showed the efficiency. This time we've got airflow to noise quality ratios. So this is essentially the airflow to the air quality score that I just gave each fan. It's the ratio between those two figures. So obviously the higher up the graph the fans go, the better noise quality you're getting for the higher airflows. And again, the Silverstone Air Slimmer generating a lot of airflow, but it also has very good noise quality for that airflow. And essentially what we're looking at here are similar airflows and what the noise quality is like at those airflows. So we've got some pretty good results for the Arctic. It doesn't generate a lot of air in some situations. It's quite a slow spinning fan, but it does have very, very good sound quality. So that's something to bear in mind, as does the Alpha Cool, Thermal Right, the Roswell or a Casa Slim fan as well, and also the Corsair overall. It's got that great airflow and reasonable efficiency at full speed, but not doing so well at lower speeds, so that's why it kind of falls off the graph there. So other fans, obviously, you want to try and avoid the Silverstone FN124, which is the older Silverstone Slim fan, the ProLimitech Ultra Sleek Vortex, and the ID Cooling 12015 XT, just not doing very well when it comes to airflow versus noise quality. Now, well done if you've made it this far. We're moving on to some of the final results now, and we have CPU temperature. So this is essentially strapping one of the fans to a radiator in the liquid loop that I am cooling an 11600K with, and recording the CPU temperature at various different speeds. So starting with full speed on the fan, so this is basically purely down to static air pressure, or static pressure should I say, and airflow, and we have this Silverstone Air Slimmer at the top with the lowest CPU temperature. So So real world results here, your choice of fan will impact your cooling result. And as we've seen here, the Silverstone cooling our CPU by several degrees compared to, for example, the older Silverstone, the FM124. It was a good 7 or 8 degrees cooler than that fan, which is quite impressive. And dropping down the RPM range, again, the Silverstone doing really great. So this kind of corroborates our findings that the Silverstone was actually generating a lot of airflow at those RPMs. So this is kind of proving my previous test results. And the alpha cool not doing too badly here, and kind of the usual culprit sitting there at the lower end. The Silverstone FM124 not doing great, and the ID cooling fan as well not doing that well. The Arctic fan, now it doesn't generate a lot of airflow compared to other fans spinning at the similar speed, which is why it's sitting at the bottom here. But what it is actually doing is generating a reasonable amount of airflow in terms of airflow to noise. So that's something, again, that you should be wary of here, is that fans sitting at the bottom of these graphs aren't always generating worse cooling results, because they might be offering better airflow at higher RPMs, but for lower noise levels. So just something to bear in mind, that it's an interesting test. It's kind of an out of the box setting to a fixed RPM, away you go kind of test, and these are the results that you would get from that. But where a fan scores consistently highly here is where you should be taking note, and obviously that happens with the Silverstone Air Slimmer 120 RGB. So we've got a great result here for Silverstone, topping the chart in every single test. So extra well done if you made it here, because we're at the final couple of graphs, and next we'll be moving on to the conclusions. And first up, we have the airflow to noise efficiency to price ratio. So essentially, if we go back a couple of graphs, we look at the airflow to noise efficiency ratio. So that's airflow versus noise, one divided by the other. And then we basically put that in a ratio to price. You're looking at essentially the efficiency of generating airflow versus noise compared to how expensive the fan is. The higher up the graph, the cheaper the fan is for that efficiency ratio. So one thing to bear in mind here, though, is that yes, a fan will sit at the top of the graph if it costs next to nothing, but that doesn't mean it's a great fan in terms of generating lots of noise and for little airflow. So what we're looking at is kind of a balancing act here. There are some super cheap fans on test, but equally we know that a lot of them don't perform that well. So we know that the thermal right fan that comes top here in both these graphs actually is a reasonable performer overall, but it also costs a heck of a lot less than a lot of fans on test, so that's why it comes top. So next up, we have the Roswell or Akasa fan. Again, we know that that fan from previous tests has done pretty well in a lot of the graphs. And so too to some extent has the Arctic. But all three of those fans are very, very cheap. So that's why they're sitting at the top of the graph. Now, the Silverstone, obviously, it's not one of the cheaper fans. It's close to $20, maybe a little bit more in some areas, but it offers stellar performance. So what you can't assume from this graph is that fans sitting near the top of the graph are going to be the best option for you. All they're saying is they're offering good efficiency, probably, but at a very, very low price. And both the price and efficiency have a huge impact. So if it's super cheap, that's great, but it might be crap in terms of efficiency. And really, that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the ID cooling fan here. So it's very, very cheap, especially for an RGB enabled fan, but it doesn't perform that well. So that's why it kind of sits in just about the top half of the table. But its performance would suggest that it should sit nearer the bottom, but it doesn't because it's pretty cheap. So moving on to the next graph, this is literally how much airflow in meters a second you get per dollar spent. So if you want to spend, if you want to get the best airflow for the least cash, this is the graph for you. Obviously, that's not taking into account airflow or not taking into account noise or efficiency or anything like that. It's literally just airflow per buck, basically. So thermal right again doing pretty well here. The Roswell and Akasa slim fans doing pretty well. The Arctic again doing reasonably well, and thankfully most of those fans have decent airflow to noise ratios as well. The Silverstone again coming in fourth place, offering decent airflow per dollar. and the ID cooling drops down a place here. So it is very, very cheap, but it does offer reasonable airflow, but it is fairly cheap as well. But again, given how cheap it is, you'd expect it to be way up the graph here, but it's not, because it doesn't generate that much airflow considering how much it costs. So an interesting graph there to end on, and let's move on to the conclusion. So what do we make of the Silverstone Air Slimmer 120 ARGB then? Well, there is no doubt that this is the new performance king. It's by far and away the best fan out there if you are looking for a high-performing, slim 120mm fan. It's head and shoulders above Silverstone's previous efforts, and it basically wipes the floor with every single other fan out there right now. Now, others do get close or even match or even slightly better it in one or two situations, but overall, this is the fan that was sitting at the top of most of the graphs. And as you see in my group test and in the data that we just looked at, there's a lot of data there, and this thing just came top in pretty much all of it, which is absolutely great because it's nice to be able to unequivocally recommend a product. It's rare that you can actually do that, but I can definitely do that today with the Air Slimmer 120 ARGB. It looks fantastic with its RGB lighting. It is reasonably expensive, but then if you're getting the very, very best out there in terms of slim 120mm fans and you want to strap this thing to your Mini ICX case or a radiator or something like that, you know that you are getting the best performance. And it's pretty flexible too. It's got a decent high-end speed, decent high-end performance, but you can rein it in, and critically, even at half speed or lower RPMs, it still performs really well, both in terms of raw performance and in terms of its noise to airflow ratio. So that's it from me today. Fantastic fan here from Silverstone. Have no problems at all recommending it. And obviously, don't forget to check out the group test of slim 120mm fans. There is a slightly cheaper version of this model that I'll link to in the description below as well that doesn't have RGB lighting, so don't forget to check that out. That's it from me today. We'll be back with more reviews very, very soon. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll be back shortly.